The message came without warning on a quiet morning in the colony of New. Lisa Porter stood in her office looking out at the green hills and the small city her people had built over 20 years. She was the administrator of this world, responsible for 60,000 human lives. When her communication officer rushed in with fear on his face, she knew something terrible had arrived. The Dominion had come. She watched the transmission on her screen. A massive reptilian figure filled the display, his scales dark green and his eyes burning with ancient pride. He called himself Sovereign, High Commander of the War Fleet. Behind him, she could see hundreds of warships blocking out the stars. Spoke slowly as if addressing children. He told the humans they had 72 hours to surrender their colony. He explained that they had ruled the outer spiral arm for 3,000 years. They had conquered 47 species. Not one had ever defeated them in battle. He said resistance was not just foolish but impossible. The humans would kneel or the humans would burn. Lisa watched the entire message twice. Then she called Burke to her office. Was her defense coordinator, a former Marine who had served Earth for 20 years before retiring to this quiet colony world. He was a tall man with gray at his temples and calm eyes that had seen too much war. He watched the transmission without expression. When it ended, Lisa asked him what he thought. Said they were confident, too confident. They expected surrender because surrender was all they had ever known. 3,000 years of easy victories had made them blind. They saw humans as just another weak species waiting to be crushed. Lisa asked if they could fight. Smiled for the first time. He said humans had been fighting impossible wars since they lived in caves. He told her about ancient battles where small groups held against massive armies. He spoke of resistance movements that outlasted empires. Humans did not surrender just because someone told them to. Lisa contacted Earth through the emergency channels. Admiral Grace received her transmission at Defense Command. The Admiral was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and a reputation for winning battles that others called unwinnable. She listened to Lisa describe the situation and then asked a simple question. Did the people of New want to fight? Lisa said yes. Every person she had spoken to said the same thing. They would not kneel to these creatures. They would not give up their homes without a struggle. Admiral nodded. She told Lisa that a relief fleet would take 3 weeks to arrive. Until then, the colony would need to hold on its own. She promised that Earth would not abandon them. She told Lisa to trust her people and trust Burke. Then she ended the transmission to begin preparing her ships. Wasted no time. He gathered the colonial militia, about 2,000 men and women who had trained for emergencies. Most were farmers, engineers, teachers, and shopkeepers. They were not professional soldiers, but they were humans, and humans learned fast. He taught them how to fight without fighting directly. He showed them how to strike supply lines and disappear before the enemy could respond. He explained that they expected a traditional battle where their superior numbers would guarantee victory. The humans would not give them that battle. Meanwhile, grew confused aboard his flagship. 24 hours passed with no surrender. His advisors told him the humans were simply slow to accept reality. They assured him the surrender would come. It always did. 48 hours passed, still nothing. Ordered his communication officer to send another message. This time, he showed the humans recordings from conquered worlds, cities burning, populations in chains, species that had been reduced to servants of the Dominion. He told the humans this would be their fate if they did not submit immediately. Lisa watched this second message with and her senior staff. When it ended, she asked if anyone wanted to change their mind. No one spoke. She saw fear in their eyes, but also something stronger. She saw determination. She recorded a response. She kept it short. She told that the people of New had discussed his offer carefully. Their answer was no. They would not surrender today. They would not surrender tomorrow. They would not surrender ever. Received this message on his bridge surrounded by his officers. For a long moment he said nothing. His scales shifted color slightly, a sign of anger among his kind. Then he laughed. He told his officers that the humans were amusing. They had spirit. He said crushing that spirit would make the conquest more satisfying. He ordered his ground forces to prepare for landing. He wanted the colony taken within 1 week. His subcommander, a veteran named, asked if they should adjust their tactics. Perhaps the humans required a different approach. Dismissed the idea. The way had worked for 3,000 years. It would work again. Humans were soft creatures from a small world. They would break like all the others. But watching from the back of the bridge, a young officer named felt something he had never felt before. He had studied the reports on humans. He knew they came from a harsh world full of predators and disasters. He knew they had a long history of warfare among themselves. He wondered if perhaps this species was different. He kept these thoughts to himself. Questioning the sovereign was not wise. Anew, Burke stood on a hill overlooking the landing zones they would likely use. Beside him stood the commander of the ground defense forces. She was a woman who had grown up on this colony, who had helped build it with her own hands. She was not going to watch it fall. Told her the next few days would be hard. They had numbers and technology on their side. The humans had only their courage and their refusal to quit. Said that would be enough. The sun set over New. In orbit above, the fleet prepared for what they believed would be another easy conquest. On the ground below, humans checked their weapons and said goodbye to their families. None of them knew if they would survive the coming battle. But all of them knew they would rather die standing than live on their knees. The self-proclaimed alphas of the galaxy were about to learn that some prey bites back. They fell from the sky like metal rain. Hundreds of them descended toward New, each carrying 50 warriors eager for conquest. Watched from his flagship with satisfaction. This was how the Dominion had always operated. Overwhelming force, total dominance, swift victory. They landed in the fields outside Porto, the capital city. Soldiers poured out in perfect formation, their weapons raised and their eyes scanning for targets. They expected to see humans running in terror. They expected white flags and desperate pleas for mercy. They saw empty fields. Commander led the ground forces personally. He was a veteran of 30 conquests and had never known failure. He ordered his troops to advance toward the city in standard formation, a wall of armored warriors designed to break enemy morale through sheer intimidation. They marched for 2 hours without seeing a single human. Grew uneasy. This was not how conquered species behaved. By now there should have been panicked civilians, local leaders begging for terms or at least a token defense force to crush. Instead, there was only silence and empty streets. The first attack came from nowhere. A supply convoy moving behind the main force suddenly exploded. 3 transport vehicles carrying ammunition and food went up in flames. By the time soldiers reached the scene, the attackers had vanished. They found no bodies. They found no evidence of who had struck. Reported too, the sovereign dismissed it as a minor setback. Primitive species sometimes managed lucky strikes. It meant nothing. But more attacks followed. Burke had divided the human forces into small teams spread across the highlands surrounding the city. Each team knew the land intimately. They had grown up hiking these hills, hunting in these forests, farming these valleys. They saw only terrain. The humans saw home. Led one of these teams personally. She waited in a rocky pass as a patrol marched below. Her people numbered only 12 against 60 enemy soldiers, but they had the high ground and the element of surprise. She gave the signal. Her team fired from cover, dropping a dozen in the first seconds. Before the enemy could organize a response, the humans slipped away through paths they had used since childhood. They gave chase but found only empty wilderness. This pattern repeated across the colony. Human teams struck at patrols, supply lines, and communication posts. They never engaged in direct battle. They never gave the target to destroy. They simply appeared, caused damage, and vanished. Lost 200 soldiers in the first 3 days. Not a devastating number for an army of 20,000, but the losses troubled him. In previous conquests, he had lost perhaps 50 soldiers total. The psychological effect on his troops was worse than the actual casualties. Soldiers began seeing threats everywhere. They jumped at shadows. They fired at nothing. Sleep became difficult because the humans seemed to attack most often at night. This confused them deeply. Their species was diurnal, most active during daylight hours. They had assumed all intelligent species were the same. They had never faced an enemy that turned darkness into a weapon. Led a night raid on the 5th day that changed everything. His team infiltrated an ammunition depot located in a valley the enemy believed was secure. They moved in total darkness, using only hand signals and their knowledge of the terrain. The guards never saw them coming, and his team planted explosives throughout the depot and without firing a single shot. When the explosives detonated, the resulting blast was visible from orbit. 3 days of ammunition for the entire ground force went up in a single moment. Received this news in silence. His scales had gone from dark green to nearly black, a sign of fury among his kind. He demanded to know how primitive humans had penetrated a secured position without detection. No one could answer him. Young studied the reports from the ground with growing fascination. He noticed patterns the older officers missed. The humans were not simply resisting, they were learning. Each attack was more sophisticated than the last. They adapted their tactics based on responses. They seemed to improve with every engagement. He mentioned this during a briefing. The subcommander told him to keep such observations to himself. Suggesting that humans might be genuine threats was close to questioning the sovereign's judgment. On the ground, they eventually reached Porto and occupied the city. They expected this victory to break human resistance. Instead, they found empty buildings and no population. The humans had evacuated into the highlands, taking everything useful with them. Stood in the abandoned city center feeling something unfamiliar. It took him a moment to recognize the emotion. It was doubt. Demanded another surrender broadcast. He appeared on all channels, his voice heavy with anger barely contained. He told the humans their capital had fallen. He told them further resistance would only bring more suffering. He gave them one final chance to submit. Lisa Porter responded from a hidden location in the mountains. She stood in a cave lit by portable lights, surrounded by her people. She looked tired but unbroken. She told that buildings were just buildings. Taking an empty city proved nothing. The humans were still here. The humans were still fighting, and they would keep fighting until they left their world. She ended her message with a single word: no. That word echoed through the fleet. It spread to the ground forces in the occupied city. It reached, who listened with something approaching admiration. He had studied 47 conquered species. Not one had ever said no after losing their capital. The humans were different, he was certain now. What he did not know yet was how different. He did not know about the fleet admiral was preparing. He did not know that humans had spent their entire history fighting enemies that seemed impossible to defeat. He did not know that the word no was written into their very nature. But he would learn, they all would learn. They had conquered a galaxy by making others afraid. They had never met a species that simply refused to be afraid. And that refusal was about to cost them everything they had built. The Galactic Assembly watched new with growing wonder. Observer, a crystalline being from one of the oldest species in known space, documented every development for the permanent record. In his thousands of years of service, he had witnessed many conflicts. None had surprised him like this one. The humans were entering their second week of resistance. No species had ever lasted this long against the Dominion. News of the battle spread through the galaxy faster than official channels could control. Traders carried stories from system to system. Diplomats whispered in corridors. Species that had lived under domination for centuries began paying attention to a small human colony that refused to kneel. The collective felt this news most deeply. Their people had been conquered by the 800 years ago. Generations had lived and died under Dominion rule, their culture suppressed, their freedom a distant memory. When their leaders heard about new, something stirred in their hearts that had been dormant for centuries. Hope. They could not openly support the humans. They would destroy them, but they found other ways. Neutral traders began carrying supplies toward human space, medical equipment, food, small arms that could not be traced. They risked everything on the chance that the humans might actually win. Anew, the situation grew harder by the day. The highlands provided shelter, but resources were running low. Dr. Samuel Park worked in an underground hospital carved into the rock of a mountain. He had not slept more than 3 hours at a time in 2 weeks. His patients filled every available space. A transport ship arrived with an offer to evacuate medical personnel to safety. Samuel refused. He told the pilot that his place was with his patients. If they could not leave, neither would he. The pilot looked at him with something like awe and departed without him. Lisa Porter visited the hospital when she could. She walked among the wounded, holding hands and offering words of comfort. She knew these people had sacrificed everything for their home. The least she could give them was her presence. She asked Samuel how he kept going. He smiled despite his exhaustion and said humans had always found strength they did not know they possessed. It was simply what they did. In the occupied city, the struggle to maintain control, had organized a resistance network that made their lives miserable. Supply convoys disappeared. Communication lines went silent. Soldiers vanished in the night and were found the next morning stripped of their weapons. Reported to that holding, the city required 3 times the troops he had estimated. The humans seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. Every time he reinforced one area, attacks increased in another. It was like fighting smoke. Responded with rage. He ordered more troops from the fleet, weakening his orbital position. He demanded results, threatening to replace if the situation did not improve. The subcommander accepted these threats in silence, but his confidence was shattered. Approached privately after one such meeting, he presented data he had compiled on human resistance throughout their history. He showed the subcommander records of human conflicts where smaller forces had defeated larger ones through persistence and adaptation. He suggested that the standard Dominion approach might not work against this species. Listened carefully. Then he told that such analysis was dangerous. If the sovereign heard these ideas, would be executed for weakness. He advised the young officer to keep his thoughts hidden. But notice that did not dismiss his conclusions. The doubt had spread. Admiral Grace sent a message to Nu during the 3rd week. Her fleet had entered the edge of the system and would arrive at the colony within days. She told Lisa to hold on just a little longer. Help was coming. Lisa broadcast this news to her people. The effect was immediate. Morale surged throughout the resistance. They had survived longer than anyone thought possible. Now they only needed to survive a little more. She also sent a message to. She told him that human reinforcements were approaching. She offered him the chance to withdraw his forces and avoid further bloodshed. She said the Dominion could leave with their honor intact if they left now. Received this message on his bridge. His officers waited in tense silence for his response. The sovereign laughed. He called the human woman amusing. He said no species had ever driven from a conquest, and humans would not be the first. But some of his officers exchanged glances. They had heard the reports from the ground. They had seen the casualty figures. A few of them wondered privately if perhaps the sovereign was making a mistake. Was among those who wondered. He had accessed records of the human relief fleet. Their ships were smaller than vessels, but humans had a reputation for unconventional tactics. He calculated scenarios in his mind and found that victory was no longer certain. Anew, Burke prepared for the final phase. He gathered his team leaders in a hidden valley and explained the plan. When the human fleet arrived, the ground forces would launch a coordinated offensive. Every team would strike at once. They would retake Porto and trap the between 2 fires. Looked at the map and nodded. It was risky. Many of them would die, but it could work. She asked if he thought they could really win. Was quiet for a moment. Then he said that humans had won battles like this before. They had stood against impossible odds throughout their history. They had never been the strongest or the fastest or the most advanced, but they had something no other species seemed to possess. They simply refused to give up. Samuel Park later said the same thing to a young patient who had lost an arm in combat. The boy asked why they kept fighting when the enemy was so much stronger. Samuel told him that strength was not about size or weapons. Strength was about standing up again after being knocked down. It was about protecting what you loved even when you were afraid. Humans understood this truth in their bones. The galaxy watched and waited. They sent more supplies. Observer recorded every detail. And in the darkness of space, Admiral's fleet drew closer. The self-proclaimed alphas still held their ground, but the ground was about to shift beneath them. Admiral Grace stood on the bridge of her flagship and watched the stars blur as her fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel. They emerged in a position they had not anticipated, behind the moon of Nu where sensors could not immediately detect them. She had brought 37 ships against the armada of over 200. By any reasonable calculation, she was outnumbered but Grace had never fought reasonable battles. She studied the tactical display showing enemy positions, had arranged his fleet in a traditional formation, a crescent designed to envelope and crush any approaching enemy. It was the same formation the Dominion had used for 3,000 years. It had never failed them. Grace smiled. Predictability was a weakness she intended to exploit. She gave her orders. The human fleet would not approach directly. Instead, they would scatter into small groups, each with specific targets and objectives. Drone swarms would create confusion. Electronic warfare ships would blind sensors. The fleet would fight like the ground forces had fought, striking and withdrawing, never offering a solid target. They detected the human fleet moments later, ordered his ships to engage, expecting the humans to charge forward into his waiting formation. When they instead dispersed in all directions, his officers struggled to adapt. Battle doctrine did not account for enemies who refused to fight properly. The first drone swarms hit the left flank. Thousands of small machines, each carrying enough explosive to damage a ship, swarmed toward the largest vessels. The point defense systems activated, shooting down drones by the hundreds. But for every drone destroyed, two more took its place. While they focused on the drones, human strike groups attacked from unexpected angles. Small, fast ships targeted engine sections and weapon systems. They fired, and before the massive vessels could bring their main guns to bear, screamed orders that his captains could barely follow. He demanded they maintain formation. He demanded they crush the human ships. He demanded victories that were no longer possible. On the ground received the signal she had been waiting for. The fleet had engaged. It was time. Every human resistance team launched their attacks simultaneously. Explosions rocked positions across the colony. Supply depots, communication hubs, and command posts went up in flames within minutes of each other. Burke led the assault on Porto personally. His forces moved through streets they knew by heart, reclaiming their city block by block. The defenders, already demoralized by weeks of guerrilla attacks, found themselves facing an enemy that no longer hid. Tried to organize a defense, but his communications were compromised. Human electronic warfare had infiltrated systems during the weeks of resistance, planting viruses that activated at the worst possible moment. Orders went to the wrong units. Reinforcements arrived at empty locations. The military machine, so proud of its precision, fell into chaos. Fought in the city alongside common soldiers. He watched warriors flee from human fighters for the first time in Dominion history. These humans were smaller and weaker physically, but they fought with a fury that terrified troops who had never faced true resistance. He saw a human soldier take 3 wounds and keep fighting. He saw a human medic drag injured comrades to safety while under fire. He saw humans protect each other with a devotion that they had never shown for their own kind. In orbit, finally realized the battle was lost. His fleet had taken severe damage. A third of his ships were disabled or destroyed. The human fleet had suffered losses too, but they kept coming. They simply would not stop. He ordered a communication blackout and tried to rally his remaining forces, but individual captains had begun making their own decisions. Some retreated toward the outer system. Others surrendered to human ships. The Great Armada, undefeated for 3,000 years, was fragmenting. Contacted from the surface, he reported that Porto was lost. Human forces controlled most of the colony. The ground campaign had failed completely. Demanded that retake the city. The subcommander said it was impossible. They had underestimated the humans from the beginning. They had expected another easy conquest and found something else entirely. What they had found was a species that fought not for conquest or glory, but for their homes and families. A species that drew strength from hardship rather than being broken by it. A species that had faced extinction on their own world and survived, becoming harder and more determined with each challenge. Rejected this analysis. He accused of cowardice and declared that he would take command of ground forces personally. He would show these humans what a true warrior could do. Saw the madness in his sovereign's eyes. The absolute certainty that had made a legend was now destroying him. He could not accept a reality where they were not supreme. The subcommander made a decision. He told that his leadership had failed. Under ancient Dominion law, a commander who led his forces to disaster could be removed. He was invoking that law now. Killed him without hesitation. He drew his blade and cut down on the bridge of his own flagship. Then he looked at the other officers and asked if anyone else wished to question his authority. No one spoke, but watching from the surface through a communication link, saw the fear in their eyes. The Dominion was breaking apart. Burke reached the central plaza of Porto as the sun rose. Human flags flew from buildings that had been headquarters hours before. Around him, his soldiers cheered and embraced. They had retaken their home. He looked up at the sky where flashes of light marked the continuing space battle. The fight was not over yet, but the tide had turned. And it would never turn back. stood alone on the bridge of his crippled flagship. The great vessel drifted in space, its engines dead and its weapons silent. Around him, screens showed the destruction of everything he had built. The armada was gone. His soldiers on the ground had surrendered. 3,000 years of Dominion supremacy had ended in a matter of weeks. Admiral's voice came through the communication system. She offered him terms of surrender. She promised that he and his surviving crew would be treated with dignity if they laid down their weapons. She said humans did not seek revenge, only peace. Listened to her words and felt only rage. He could not accept this reality. They were the alphas of the galaxy. They did not surrender. They did not lose. This could not be happening. He gathered the few crew members still loyal to him and prepared for a final stand. When human Marines boarded his ship, they would find him waiting. He would die as a should die, in battle against his enemies. The boarding was swift and professional. Human soldiers moved through the corridors in small teams, securing sections and accepting surrenders from crew who had lost their will to fight. Most of the enemy simply laid down their weapons and waited. Met them in the central chamber of his ship. He stood with a blade in each hand, surrounded by his last 10 warriors. He roared a challenge in the ancient tongue, demanding single combat with the human commander. The Marines did not accept his challenge. They did not need to prove anything. Instead, they used stun weapons to disable his warriors one by one. When charged at them, 3 Marines tackled him to the ground and restrained him without killing him. He screamed that they were cowards. He demanded death in battle. The Marine sergeant, a woman named Kelly Torres, told him calmly that humans did not kill prisoners. He would face justice for his crimes, but he would face it alive. Was carried off his ship in restraints, still cursing and struggling. The last image the galaxy saw of the great sovereign was a defeated creature being led away by humans half his size. Watched this broadcast from the surface of Nu. He was now the highest-ranking officer still free, though he had stopped giving orders hours ago. His soldiers had surrendered around him, and he had not tried to stop them. He requested a meeting with Lisa Porter. Human guards escorted him to a building in Porto where the administrator had set up temporary headquarters. She looked exhausted but stood straight when he entered. He bowed his head to her, not a gesture of submission but of respect. He told her that the Dominion was finished. The fleet was destroyed. The ground forces had surrendered, was a prisoner. Everything the Dominion had built over 3,000 years had collapsed. Lisa asked him what would happen now. Said that was a question for his people to answer. The Dominion had ruled through fear. When other species saw that fear could be defeated, they would rise up. They would face rebellions from a dozen conquered peoples. The empire was already dead. It simply had not finished falling yet. He paused and then asked her something that had troubled him since the battle began. He asked how humans had remained unbroken, how they had faced certain defeat and refused to accept it. What made them different from every other species that had crushed? Lisa thought about the question for a long moment. Then she told him that humans did not fight because they expected to win. They fought because some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds. Home, family, freedom. These things mattered more than survival. She told him that true strength was not about domination. It was about what you protected and who you stood beside. They had conquered through fear, but fear was a weak foundation. Love was stronger. Hope was stronger. The bonds between people who would die for each other were stronger than any army. Listened and understood. His people had forgotten these truths if they had ever known them. They had become so focused on being alphas that they had lost what made a species truly great. He thanked her for her words. Then he offered himself as a prisoner, prepared to face whatever justice humans demanded. Lisa surprised him. She said humans were not interested in vengeance. The war was over. If was willing to help his people find a new path, a path without conquest and domination, then he was free to go. The choice was his. 6 months later, the Galactic Assembly gathered for a historic session. Observer presided as humanity was elevated to full membership, the fastest advancement in Assembly history. Species that had watched the battle for Nu with wonder now welcomed humans as equals. Ambassador Daniel addressed the gathered representatives. He was a young man chosen for this role specifically because he had no military background. Humanity wanted the galaxy to know that they sought partnership, not empire. He spoke of the war not as a victory to celebrate but as a tragedy to learn from. He said humans had fought because they had no choice, not because they loved conflict. He invited any species that sought freedom to stand with humanity. Together, they could build something better than the old order of fear and domination. When he finished, something remarkable happened. The representative stood and pledged her people to the human cause. Then another species rose. Then another. Within minutes, a dozen representatives were standing, species that had suffered under rule for centuries finally daring to imagine a different future. Watched from the back of the chamber, he had traveled to the assembly as part of a reformist movement within society. Many of his people had rejected the old ways. They saw that the path of conquest had led only to destruction. After the session ended, he approached Daniel. He asked if humans would help to learn a different way of being, not as conquerors being punished, but as a people trying to change. Daniel extended his hand, a human gesture of friendship had learned to recognize. He said humans believed in redemption. If they genuinely wanted to change, humanity would stand beside them. Took his hand. The self-proclaimed alphas had fallen, but from that fall, something new was rising. A galaxy where strength meant lifting others up rather than pushing them down. A galaxy where the species that refused to kneel had taught everyone what true courage looked like. The humans had not conquered they had done something far more powerful. They had shown the galaxy that the old ways could be broken. And in breaking them, they had set everyone free.